His research interests include southern Italy, architecture and ornament, and intercultural interactions in art history. He completed his doctoral dissertation at the University of York on architecture and aristocratic power in 18th century Sicily. And recently, in May 2023, he published Architecture, Opportunity and Conflict in 18th century Sicily, Rebuilding After Natural Disaster. So his paper today is titled The Palace Facades of Southeastern Sicily, Classicism and Metamorphosis. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Martin.
Thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me to present at this interesting day. So what I want to do today is to, I'm assuming that most of the audience will be quite unfamiliar with the buildings and the places that I'm going to be talking about. So I'm going to be talking about the palace facades of southeastern Sicily, Classicism and Metamorphosis. As you can probably already see from the first image, we're looking at architecture that has a combination or dialogue between canonical architectural elements from the Renaissance treatises in combination with a very interesting local form of stone carving. And it relates to a book my doctoral research and a book I published last year. I've got a slide just as an introduction, a background introduction, and then we'll get on to actually talking about the architecture. So the island of Sicily is historically divided into three areas: Val d'Emone, Val di Mazara, and Val di Noto. So the area that I'm going to be talking about is the Val di Noto, which is the southeastern part of Sicily, with Catania as the biggest city there. And at the time that I'm talking about, in 1693, Sicily was a Spanish colony. In 1693, there was an earthquake in the Val di Noto area, which was one of the largest or most powerful earthquakes recorded in what is now Italy, resulting in the deaths of perhaps 1 in 5 of the population of Val di Noto. A large number of towns were affected. Some towns were pretty much completely destroyed, including Catania. So some towns were rebuilt. A lot of buildings were a lot of palaces, buildings were rebuilt, and some towns were actually even relocated to new sites. This rebuilding after the earthquake, which continued into the 18th century, allowed local aristocrats and church people to, in some cases, kind of benefit from this rebuilding, because the rebuilding in some cases offered an opportunity for people to build palaces in a more what would then be considered a more modern style, or in a more prestigious location. So there was no, and although Sicily was a Spanish colony at the time, there was no overall coordination for the rebuilding. So the rebuilding was mainly determined by conflict and negotiation between the local aristocrats in each town. So what I'm going to do, and I hope I haven't tried to include too much in this, I'm just going to show some different aspects of the way that there is this accommodation and dialogue between classical, let's call it for canonical classical architecture, and certain local stone carving traditions. So I'm going to start off by saying something about the earlier architecture of Catania. And by earlier, I mean the immediate post-earthquake architecture in Catania. So buildings that were built probably within the first decade or so after the 1693 earthquake. One of the things that I think some of this decoration can be related to, and I hope this doesn't seem too reductive, but I think that some of the, we'll see in a moment, that I think some of the architecture in Catania has got strong connections to a decorative tradition related perhaps to the Italian groteschi, and also to what is sometimes been called a kind of Mannerist decoration, found particularly in certain Northern European illustrations, as in certain Northern European treatises such as Vredemin de Vries and Vendel detailing. So I mean this almost vine-like Edenic decoration, where it looks as if the facades are being almost colonized by this kind of often plant-like decoration, but how in some senses the decoration appears to both kind of cover the classical, the more canonical classical members, and also appears to be almost growing out of the facade. The inclusion of putti and the inclusion of these caryatid sculptures that often have one hand, one arm raised. So the first building I want to talk about is the Palazzo Massa di San Demetrio in Catania. This building, and it's difficult to get good photographs of these buildings because they tend to be 2 or 3 stories, but they're often quite long. So on this building, there's probably about another 3 or 4 bays that go either side of the photograph I've shown. They're also often in quite narrow streets. Here we can see some of the features of the architecture around Catania. So as some of you may know, Catania is in the shadow of the volcano Mount Etna. Certain things about this earlier or this immediate post-earthquake architecture in Catania is these piers or kind of pedestals made of the dark volcanic stone. Then you get the giant order rusticated capitals. Then there's which are always white, and the decoration around openings and the rusticated capitals is usually of a white, sometimes marble, I think sometimes a white limestone, and also stucco. Then there's the grey plaster, and then you can see that often in these buildings in Catania you get the main portal and the kind of windows directly above it create a sculptural unit, where you can see that it has that vegetal vine-like decoration that to me suggests in some ways harvests, abundance. You have the caryatid sculpture with the kind of one arm above that appears to be kind of emerging into the sunlight from the building. You have those in the ground floor and around at the top floor window, which was the piano nobile, and then you might get the putti heads in the kind of middle part. Another building, this is a monastery, not a palace, but you can probably already see quite strong similarities to how a certain kind of classicism has been adapted in this part of Sicily. There are a lot of similarities to the Palazzo Massa. We've got the same volcanic stone base. We've got the rusticated giant order pilasters. This one, the main portal is more canonical classicizing, but you can see one of the windows has a kind of decorative unit, again, which is very similar to the Palazzo Massa. Again, the same, the caryatids and this vegetal decoration and then putti, and then we also get the Sicilian mensole, which are the balcony supports with the mascheroni, the carved faces at the end, which I hope to say a bit more about in a moment, a bit later. The last example of this adaptation of classicism in the Catania area is the Palazzo Biscari, which was built by the kind of most prominent landowning family of the Catania area. Parts of this palace were actually, a lot of the palace was actually built in the second half of the 18th century, but the sea-facing facade, which was built pretty much directly after the earthquake, again has these features of the architecture of Catania in terms of the materials, the colours, the very similar sculptural features, and some connection perhaps to those this Mannerist style decoration. The second part is moving to the town of Noto, which is only about maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours drive from Catania, but you can probably already see that the architecture there is quite different. So Noto was originally a hill town. It was rebuilt after the earthquake, it was rebuilt on a new location according to a grid plan. It uses a kind of honey-colored limestone, which is probably more similar to the kind of like the building material found in most of Sicily. The volcanic grey kind of building material is peculiar, I think, to the Catania Mount Etna area. The palaces in Noto these are a little bit later. These are more towards the middle of the 18th century. The earlier palaces, which were demolished, that may have been rebuilt immediately after the earthquake, we don't have records of what they were like. But so you can see that it's a relatively restrained form of classicism that seems to mainly follow forms, members, use of classical forms that is probably fairly similar to what might be found in other parts of Western Europe. There's some decoration, these these urns along the top, and the kind of double pilasters create a kind of perhaps more ornamented effect. But certainly for 18th century Sicilian architecture, it's a restrained form of classicism. This one, the Palazzo Impellizzeri, again, it's difficult to get good photographs of these buildings. Again, a fairly understated, restrained classicism. Most of the palaces in Noto, there are probably about 25 aristocratic palaces that date from the 18th and 19th century. Pretty much all of them follow let's call it a relatively restrained classicism in the facade decoration. One of the palaces I'd like to say a little bit more about, the Palazzo Nicolacci, is an exception in Noto. Most of the facade itself, including the portal, is not so different from a lot of the other palaces in the rest in Noto, and probably in many ways a lot of other 18th century palaces in many parts of Europe, perhaps. The upper stories have got these interesting 6 balconies, and I'm not going to talk through each balcony, but each balcony has the mensolae, the balcony supports, and each balcony has got its own different mensolae sculpture. And I think nobody has really been able to find a convincing iconology for these mensolae sculptures that is kind of consistent or convincing enough to go across more than one building. This building, I think, is quite an interesting one. I think it's quite open to interpretation. To me, it has perhaps an idea of renunciation of the world. We've got these and perhaps or renunciation of the body, perhaps, and looking towards the spiritual. There are these emaciated bearded male figures that don't have arms but have angelic wings and appear to be perhaps ascending. We've got the singing heads of angels, and then there's this strange figure in the middle that seems to be holding a flute. Again, an emaciated monk-like figure with what look like rosary beads. And then there's this unusual, or this foliage face, which you find in quite a lot of this architecture, which I know you find across a lot of Baroque and Rococo decoration in other parts of Europe. This balcony in the same palace may have been below the bedroom of the young prince, and we see a a prince transforming into a lion, and then at the lower part, the kind of console base of of each mensola, there's the foliage face. So some of this architecture may have a connection to what was to the life of the patrons, perhaps to what happened in the room where the balcony was. But as I say, it's kind of, I don't think any research has been done on trying to relate it to classical mythology, to Sicilian sayings, proverbs, but I don't think as I say, anybody's really found any convincing key. There is a certain formulaic quality to them. There are certain images that repeat. And again, I hope I'm not going too fast. Although I realize I've only got 5 minutes left. I wanted to show another aspect of this 18th century Sicilian architecture. So the town of Ragusa is different again. This in the earthquake, the hill town part of Ragusa was completely destroyed, but in this case, it was rebuilt pretty much according to the pre-earthquake street plan. There are some interesting palaces in Ragusa which are more from the latter part of the 18th century. A lot of the balcony carving, I think, in Ragusa, well, the facade carving combines designs from that can also be found in Rococo images, Rococo printed treatises particularly from France and Central Europe. So, for example, the Jean Aurel Messonnier, France Xavier Habermas. But then there is also the balcony. So the lower stories of the palaces in some ways have designs that we can find in buildings in other parts of Europe. These kind of late 18th century Rococo designs around the window, for example. One of the differences is the Sicilian. You find it in other parts of southern Italy and possibly maybe in Spain, but I think there's a distinctive curved ironwork balcony with what are sometimes called the fioroni, which are these slightly sadistic but kind of decorative wrought iron flower shapes. The lower part of these of many of the palaces in Ragusa is relatively canonical or can be related to images from Rococo treatises mainly. The upper parts, the upper windows again have got the piano nobile. You have the mensole with these again this distinctive stone carving, and you can see how they're always designed to be directed at the passerby. They're aimed at they're to be viewed by somebody standing in the street below the palace. I haven't sure that there are this Palazzo Cosentino has got 4 of these carved these balconies with this interesting sculpture. This one has got some figures. There's a figure with what looks like a cornucopia. There's a figure holding something that looks like a scroll shape. There's a figure here that seems to have perhaps a monkey. There's another balcony. I mean, the sculptural style suggests that they were all done by the same sculptors or the same workshop. This one, at one point, I was pursuing something related to the 5 senses. There's a figure with these what look like spectacles. The feather could relate perhaps to the sense of touch, but the apples taste and smell, but it doesn't really work. It doesn't work fully. What they do have in common, I think, is often a sense of luxury or a sense of perhaps abundance and of a kind of life of wealth and luxury that might be going on inside the palace, which perhaps is strange given that a lot of the population were kind of half starving most of the time. But there's this connection perhaps with agriculture, which is also what the Sicilian barons, where their wealth mainly came from. The last part, and I'll know I've only got a couple of minutes left, that the one other palace in Ragusa, the Palazzo La Rocca, again, not a great photo. I apologize, and the balconies for this palace are badly in need of restoration. This is a balcony that one of the local historians has named balcony of the Cavalier. We see on a Cavalier, a strange, dissolute, fanged, shabby-looking figure with these glasses, and then above, a figure with a gourd, and I'm not sure what that is that the figure is holding. I'd be interested in any suggestions. The mensola, the right balcony support, or mensola, as I say, has got this quite interesting decoration of the fanged figure with glasses. It could perhaps represent a doctor. It could be a blood-sucking lawyer or tax collector or accountant. There's a figure on this side that is holding what I assume would be a barrel of wine and making what might be the Italian kind of chin flick gesture, which can have various meanings. I think one of the meanings might be a kind of "I don't care about you" kind of gesture. There's another balcony, the balcony of the Amorini, which again may be below the bedroom of the patrons. So the decoration of the last two palaces I've shown, the Palazzo Cosentini and the Palazzo La Rocca, perhaps has more of a, compared to some of the decoration in other parts of the Val di Noto, for example, the decoration from Catania that I showed at the beginning, has got perhaps a humorous, slightly kind of caricature, humorous quality to it, possibly, which is different from other parts of the Val di Noto and other parts of Sicily. To conclude, I'm indebted to the research of architectural historians, particularly historians based in Sicily, who are doing, who are kind of furthering research on these buildings. The buildings are quite difficult to research. Most of a lot of the palaces, the architects are unknown. These historians and others are people that have done a lot of the groundwork for dates, names of patrons, names of architects where known, and have also suggested possible connections between some of the decoration, the facade decoration, and with treatises that are known to have been in the inventories of ecclesiastical buildings in Sicily, such as Jesuit seminaries, and also in aristocratic collections. In conclusion, I've gone a bit fast, perhaps. I wanted to kind of show different aspects of this interesting architecture. I think there's clearly in these facades an engagement with these 15th, 16th century Renaissance treatises, a more perhaps international language or Western European language of architecture. There is also, we see the adaptation of newer Rococo inspired forms. So clearly Sicily is within is in communication with the other parts of Italy and other parts of Europe. It's not a kind of backwater, but there is this assertion of local identity, I think, particularly in this stone carving language, which probably has roots that go back before the 1693 earthquake. The ornament challenges taxonomy. There are elements where we see features that appear to be both plant, perhaps, and human, animal and human, human and angel, architectural member and some other, and plant or human, and so on. And it in some cases it produces interesting questions about aristocratic decorum, in terms of why some of the Sicilian aristocrats had certain images on their facades. There's a sense of metamorphosis of this kind of life that is always seems to be generated from within the facades. which is one of the things that I find very most interesting. So I'll stop there. So thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Martin. That was wonderful. Our next